As promised, it did not take long for me to answer the knock at the door when our next guest came knocking, wanting to talk about Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, April the 6th, 1987, dubbed and billed as the Super Fight. And this man wrote a book called The Super Fight. He is based in England, from Northern Ireland. Brian Doogan is here as a guest on the Big Fight Weekend podcast right now. Thank you for finding us. Thank you for finding us on Big Fight Weekend. Thank you for connecting to me. And as I said, it was an easy sell in the figurative sense for you to come on and talk Leonard-Hagler and the nostalgia. Brian, it's great to have you.
Thank you, TJ, and it's great to be on your show. Really delighted.
All right. So I always love asking different things of authors that are basically the same thing. What made you want to write a book about Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, 1987, and the Super Fight?
I think it's easy. They're two of the greatest fighters who ever put on the gloves. They were the centerpiece of an outstanding era, a glorious era of boxing. The Super Fight was the centerpiece. They were the two pivotal characters. You had supporting characters that included fighters of the caliber of Roberto Duran and Tommy Hearns, great fighters in their own right. But the two guys who were the supreme guys in that era were unquestionably Sugar Ray Leonard and marvelous Marvin Hagler. And the fight has just so many facets. That's why I wanted to write about it.
No question. And you have pointed out kind of in the buildup to the book, and it's accurate, that Leonard beat Duran, Leonard beat Hearns, Hagler beat Duran, Hagler beat Hearns. So this was the natural culmination of them having beaten the other greats of the foursome, the quartet, if you will, and for this fight. Again, let's go back to that time period. Marvin Hagler was menacing. He had won 12 consecutive undisputed middleweight title defenses, had lived through as menacing a title defense with Thomas Hearns a couple years earlier, survived it, and knocked him out. Sugar Ray Leonard had been retired for 3 years. We weren't sure at that time. And full disclosure, I say this all the time on the podcast, I'm as big a Sugar Ray Leonard fan as there ever was. I wasn't sure if my guy, and I was growing up as a youth, as a teenager, I wasn't sure he was ever going to fight again. And then he comes out of retirement, 3 years out of retirement, without a tune-up fight to fight Marvin Hagler. Brian, again, pick up on that point. It's one of the great subplots of this fight.
It's a tremendous subplot. And, obviously Muhammad Ali and his resurrection in the African jungle against George Foreman. And indeed, Ali coming back even to fight 15 rounds with Joe Frazier. You can make the argument that Sugar Ray Leonard's comeback against Marvin Hagler is the greatest comeback in the history of boxing. You can make that argument. You said quite rightly, TJ, that it was a 3-year layoff. You could make the case that actually those 9 unimpressive rounds against Kevin Howard, that it almost constituted a 5-year layoff, really, because he was so unimpressive in that fight against Kevin Howard, had been knocked down. As you say, Marvin Hagler, I mean, he was a guy who he made matchmakers feel like undertakers. He was a guy who obliterated the opposition. And Tommy Hearns, that famous war in 1985, that was, the kind of thing where Norman Mailer was ringside at Ali Foreman. He was ringside at Ali Frazier. He said about Hagler Hearns, he had never seen anything like it. I don't think anyone had seen anyone like it. Harry Mullen, a compatriot of my own, also from Derry in Northern Ireland. He was the editor of Boxing News. He was ringside at that fight. He felt he was going to suffer a heart attack because what he was viewing was just so overwhelming. And Marvin Hagler was quite rightly a huge favorite going into the fight against Sugar Ray Leonard. Leonard was a big underdog, and we understand why, because people couldn't see that Ray Leonard could come back to beat this man who was dominant in his domain. Marvin Hagler didn't just beat the middleweights in his era, he obliterated the middleweights in his era. That fight against Tommy Hearns, there were guys at ringside looking at one another thinking, what have I just seen? And one stunned observer looked at the guy next to him and he said, who should Hagler fight next? The other guy said, what about Russia? And that's just really what Marvin Hagler constituted at that period. I don't think that people quite understand how dominant Hagler was. He was Mike Tyson before Mike Tyson came along. And that was the challenge that Ray Leonard confronted that night in the super fight.
The voice of Brian Doogan with us here on the Big Fight Weekend podcast. His book is The Super Fight. You can find it on Amazon, wherever you get your books, online, etc. We're talking with him about the book and about the anniversary now of Sugar Ray Leonard. And we have to say it, unfortunately, sadly, the late Marvin Hagler, April the 6th, 1987. Brian is our guest here during this segment, reminiscing about it. And again, I love that. I don't know that I've ever heard it described that way, but you're right. He didn't have all the great first round immediate knockouts, but he was menacing like Mike Tyson. He was Tyson, before we ever knew about Tyson later on in the decade of the 80s and what he became. Interesting, too, on this fight that it could have maybe happened. It could have happened before the Hearns fight, Brian, as you know, and for those that are longtime fight fans know, but Ray Leonard didn't want the fight. Ray Leonard even very famously called Marvin Hagler, along with numerous other dignitaries, to a whole event where he was going to either make the announcement that he was fighting Marvin Hagler or retiring. And then he very publicly humiliated Marvin Hagler and said, "I'm not going to fight you. It'll never happen." He stood in the ring and said, "It'll never happen. Good night, everybody. I'm not fighting you." So that's another subplot here. We could have maybe gotten it earlier, but Ray Leonard was avoiding Marvin Hagler for a while. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely spot on, and almost word for word, in fact, what Ray Leonard said that night in the ring in the Baltimore Civic Center when he announced his retirement, and humiliated Marvin because he had invited Marvin specifically to be there that night at ringside. And of course, Marvin thought he was being invited because Ray was finally going to accept the challenge. But then he just slapped some more egg on Marvin's face. And as you say, said, "So long, that's it. I'm not going to fight anymore. It would be the greatest fight of all time, but we're not going to do it." And you see, that's integral, actually, to the whole drama that there was. And it's integral to what Marvin Hagler felt about life, that he would never get an even break. He had to absolutely do it the hard way from the days of being in the ghetto, growing up in the ghetto in Central Ward in Newark, New Jersey, all the way through to coming through the hard way in Brockton, Massachusetts, having to wage those Philly wars where he was the guy who had to travel and he got done with some bad decisions, but he always believed in himself. And he was this guy who then went off to solitude in Provincetown on the tip of Cape Cod, and that's how he prepared for fights. And it was primordial. It was absolutely visceral in terms of the experience of Cape Cod in the winter, in the depths of winter, along that long beach, even snow coming down, ice along the sand. It didn't matter. Marvin Hagler would be there like a ghost. And it was like he stalked the whole terrain, the whole domain that he was in terms of that middleweight division. So no wonder Sugar Ray Leonard might have had some apprehension about getting into the ring with Marvin. And I think we underestimate the gap at times between welterweight and middleweight. It's 13 pounds. It's not negligible. And I think that Ray felt he had to grow into the middleweight division. And in that 5-year hiatus, you're right, it was 3, but I suggest 5 because he just wasn't Sugar Ray Leonard that night against Kevin Howard. But I think that in those 5 years, he felt he grew into a middleweight's body, and I think that was significant for Ray. It was really important that he stepped into the ring as a bona fide middleweight, and I think he felt he did that night in 1987.
I love Brian Doogan. I love the accent. Again, accents make all of this go around. We have different people from different parts of the country and different parts of the globe. I know you crack up because I've got like the half Southern accent living in Florida. You've got the Northern Irish accent going. I love the insight, though, that you're giving. And again, the book is called The Super Fight. We're on the 34th anniversary week of Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler. And again, I cannot convey enough how big a deal this was in terms of a non-heavyweight fight and the build up to it. It's arguably one of maybe the 2 or 3 in the last 50 years most prominent non-heavyweight fights ever because of the buildup. And I know that kind of gets lost on, Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather fought 5 years ago. That was a big deal. Or Oscar De La Hoya fighting Floyd Mayweather, et cetera, and a couple of other ones that were non-heavyweight fights. But this was the biggest of big deals when it took place. And that's why Brian has written the book about it, has such great insight. Okay, here comes the fun stuff. There's always debate about who really won this thing. I even in my bio on the Big Fight Weekend website say that I will take anybody on. In the bio, I say this, Brian, I will take anybody on that says Marvin Hagler beat Sugar Ray Leonard. I believe when you go back and watch that, and I've seen it numerous times in full, Leonard won the fight in the first 5 or 6 rounds of the fight because he banked probably 4 or 5, easily 4, if not 5 of the first 6 rounds. To wit, the legendary trainer and commentator Gil Clancy on one of the calls says, I don't know what Marvin is doing because Ray is banking round after round here if this is going to go to a decision or not. That is what I believe. Brian, you wrote the book. Give me your thoughts on how it laid out here, Leonard and Hagler, and the great debate about who really won.
This is why 34 years later, TJ, we can engage in such an engaging conversation about a fight that happened so long ago, because 100 years from now, maybe not quite that long, but certainly long into the distance, people will debate this fight because it polarized everybody. Ali and Fraser, of course, in the 70s, that was something else altogether, their rivalry. But you could make the case that Hagler-Leonard was as provocative and polarizing in its own way. In terms of those first several rounds, absolutely spot on what you pointed out. Marvin Hagler, he gave away rounds. Now, people would argue with you in terms of you saying the first 4 and 5 of the first 6. But look, you can absolutely make the case. But Marvin Hagler fans would debate that point with you. But there's no question that Marvin, I think Ray did the ultimate psych job on Marvin Hagler. He got into Marvin's mind. He made Marvin actually believe that by outboxing Ray, he would actually gain more kudos than simply by tearing his head off. And I think that that's why Marvin was, a little bit different in his approach to the fight with Ray than he had been, for example, in the fight with Tommy Hearns. And I think that helped Ray incredibly. Had Marvin waged war as he had done with Tommy Hearns, I think that might have been very difficult for Ray Leonard. But Ray absolutely pulled off a masterstroke in terms of how he boxed and how he had manipulated his body into a way whereby he was able to go the 12-round distance very well and sustain it through the fight. He did taper off over the second half of the fight, which you might imagine he would. And Marvin came on strong. And in terms of the decision, it will always be debated. And certainly with a guy called Jojo Guerra submitting a scorecard of 118, 110. I mean, Bob Arum said he had filled in that scorecard before the first bell rang. And maybe you might be able to even appreciate that as a Sugar Ray Leonard fan.
Well, and yeah, we've seen even in recent times here, questionable cards. What is that judge watching? And I would agree that 10 rounds to 2. No, not on that. But one of the things that Ray did tactically, and you mentioned Ali earlier several times in our conversation, he took a page from Ali, which Ali later in his career would fight the last 30 seconds very feverishly, very actively. Step up his game. He would almost know, clock in his head, etc. Finish this round strong to impress the judges. The last impression, if you will, Brian. I think he may have won 3 or 4 of the rounds by outfighting Marvin in the last 15, 20 seconds of the round as the last impression. Do you buy that? Do you go along with that in this controversy of who won the fight?
No, I agree with you. That's precisely what Ray laid it out. He told Barry Tompkins about 6 months prior to the fight that the way to beat Marvin Hagler was to win the first 15 seconds, the middle 15 seconds, and the final 15 seconds of every round. And I think you're absolutely right. That's how he approached it. Now, Marvin was the methodical guy. the guy who, he would mow you down. He would keep after you, and that's how he thought he was going to do it. But I think there was a little bit of arrogance that night in Marvin. I don't think that Marvin actually had reached a stage in his career, TJ, which I explore in depth in the book, and this is where Ray got him. Marvin, previous to the Mugabe fight, had actually confided in Ray that he felt he was done with boxing. He got cut more easily, he got injured more easily, he didn't have the appetite anymore, and Ray knew, well, Marvin wants to retire. And of course, what Ray then saw the night that Marvin waged another war with John the Beast Mugabe after the Hearns War, what Ray saw was a guy who was on the slide, and he knew, bang, now I can get him, and I'm going to issue my challenge. Of course, Marvin didn't really want to box anymore. And so all of this is explored in the book, and it's really interesting because I had forgotten a lot of it myself, and no doubt other people have. So it's really interesting, and I just think that Marvin was undone a little bit by his own arrogance. I think he felt that at a certain point in the fight, he would just come on strong, and Ray Leonard would fold. And of course, that's what it looked like. It looked like it might happen in the 9th round, but right. Ray Leonard fought out of the corner, and this is where Ray Leonard was Ali in that sense, a fantastic boxer. But listen, Mike Tyson always said about Ray Leonard, if you think he's just a pretty face, forget about it. He's a pit bull with a pretty face. And, I think that stands, Marvin Hagler, of course, he was the monster, but there was a monster in Ray Leonard as well.
He had to be that night. And I didn't mean to fully interrupt, but I just got excited that Hagler broke everybody he fought. He broke Hearns. You mentioned the Mugabe fight, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago on this podcast, because Marquise Johns, my senior writer who's on this podcast with me, we're both based in this area. We remember the Beast in Tampa and how great he was. And then he burst on the national scene. And that was a war. Mugabe took every big punch from Hagler round after round, including an epic 6th round where he took every big punch from Marvin Hagler and fought back. And those fights maybe did take something out of Hagler, but even Hagler broke Mugabe. He broke the Beast that night. He could not break Ray Leonard in the end. And isn't that the biggest surprising thing, is that Leonard was still fresh enough, was still summoning enough stamina that Hagler didn't get him in the 9th, the 10th, the 11th round when he had gotten so many others. What about that point, Brian, real quick?
No, it's a really good point. And even then, when you fast forward into the 12th round, he's not even able to catch him up then. And Ray Leonard does the Ali shuffle. He throws his fist in the air. He says he's won the fight, and it looked like at the end of it that he had prevailed. But I'll very quick point, TJ. An old boxing writer, an old sports writer, once said that in a fight, you only see one guy. So in other words, if you're a guy who likes the fighter, that's the guy you'll see, and that's what you'll see is happening in the ring. But if you like a boxing guy, you'll look at the boxer and you'll think he won. And I think that's why there's such a disparity in terms of the decision and what fans think.
It's a great point. Brian Doogan makes a great point, because I say this all the time about life, on anything that's subjective, whether we're talking about politics and what we like or what we don't like, whether we're talking about food, Brian, and what we like and don't like. I mean, 90% of the stuff that I eat in Florida, you would probably not touch in Northern Ireland and in the UK. And probably 90% of what you eat, I wouldn't touch. What we like and what we don't like, from sports, from clothes, we bring our biases to everything, don't we? So if you love the mauling style of Marvin Hagler, the bruising style, wearing you down, of course you loved him that night because he was Marvin Hagler again. But if you love the showman, the boxer, the flash, and I did, of Ray Leonard as a little kid, I joked, you were saying earlier about the way that Marvin chose to fight Ray and chose to be the boxer and not the brawler. It's ironic that was the opposite for Ray, because when he fought Roberto Duran the first time, as you know, he chose to be the brawler and stand in front of Duran and prove I can brawl with him and I can beat him in his style, and it backfired. It didn't work. And I'm a 10-year-old TJ crushed, Brian, that Ray Leonard has lost. Somebody's got to help me accept that Sugar Ray has lost. But that's how he lost. And that's how hard I took this back in my youth. But I was so exuberant that he had beaten Marvin Hagler years later the same way. But I agree completely with you as I ramble on. We bring our biases to everything, including to what you like or don't like in judging fights.
Yes, although you mentioned food, TJ, I'm Irish. I'll eat anything. So Florida food I'd have no issue with that whatsoever. But you bring up the Roberto Duran fight, the brawl in Montreal. Colin Hart, a longtime colleague of mine on the Sun newspaper in England, he was ringside at Ali Fraser, the first and third installments. He was ringside at Ali Foreman. He was ringside at Hagler Leonard. The best fight he felt he was ever at ringside for was Leonard Duran won. And if you're a Sugar Ray Leonard fan, the way that Ray Leonard lost the fight that night, you could come out and still feel vindicated in your following of Sugar Ray Leonard because he proved himself all the way down a true fighter that night. Roberto Duran, you can make the case, may have been the best pound for pound fighter who ever lived. That's the truth. That's how great Roberto Duran was. I think people forget, long before the 80s, and when he was part of the Fabulous Four, if you like, or the Four Kings, whatever you want to refer to them, Roberto Duran had been the lightweight champion throughout the whole of the 70s, virtually.
Correct.
And he was the best lightweight who ever lived, no question. And he went into these fights in the 80s, and he prevailed over Sugar Ray Leonard. I mean, it's astonishing.
I think he had won like close to 80 fights and something like 15, 17 world championship fights before he beat Leonard that night. To your point about how great he was before that night in 1980.
Absolutely spot on. And Roberto Duran, for Ray Leonard to stand toe-to-toe with that man for 15 rounds and produce the kind of fight that it was, that said as much about Ray Leonard as you could ever, as all of the victories of Ray Leonard's career could tell you about him. He was a fighter deep down.
Love it. A few more minutes. Brian Doogan, gracious to be with me. Okay, a couple more about the book. How long did you spend working on the book? I'm always curious about this because these become passions. They become almost part of your life and your existence. But for how long for you did you work on the super fight book about Leonard-Hagler, the fight in 1987?
Well, like you, TJ, I'm not too far younger than you. So for your brawl in Montreal, Hagler Leonard was probably my version of that in a way. So I was a school kid in a small town, Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. And I was just captivated by this spectacle that was taking place far away in Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas with these neon lights. It was an entirely different world to what I grew up in, and I was just spellbound. And so I guess I can say that it was a 30-year odyssey almost. I was privileged enough during the course of my journalism career to spend quite a bit of time with both Ray and Marvin. Got to know them quite well, and so all of that went into the making of the book. The actual writing of the book, I did it quite quickly. But yeah, I spent a lot of years absorbing it all and actually spending time with the guys and the guys who were around them.
Love that. All right, and this is the unfortunate part. I hate that we have to bring this up. We've lost Marvin Hagler here over the course of the last month at the time that we're taping this. I found it touching and at the same time very real because I believe Ray Leonard when he says this. If I could give Marvin Hagler the decision to have him back here, I'd give the win back. That's essentially paraphrasing what he said upon Hagler's death. We're not supposed to lose our legends, are we, Brian? We're not supposed to lose the heroes, and yet we lost marvelous Marvin Hagler at the age of 66, too young as far as I'm concerned. So unfortunately, our memories are only going to have to be our memories of this with Marvin. But what do you want to say? I mean, he's passed away, still a legend. It's just sad that we're remarking on anniversaries because next week at the time we're taping is the anniversary of the epic fight with Hearns, and Marvin is no longer here, Brian.
It's really sad. And I think the shock was that it was just so sudden as well, TJ. And Marvin Hagler was a guy, I mean, he was almost hewn out of rock. And you felt there was a rock-like quality about him. And I suppose this is maybe an earlier generation, what they might have felt about Rocky Marciano being taken away so suddenly, the Rock. But Marvin was, he was cut from the same kind of stone. And I think that's why it's very difficult to rationalize that he has been removed from the landscape just like that. And it, in terms of that fight with Tommy Hearns, I mean, I can't say enough. It was almost like a volcano erupted in the ring, and everyone was just transfixed on this. I mentioned earlier about Harry Mullen, another colleague and friend of mine, Nick Pitt. He actually thought that something had happened to the timekeeper because, I mean, this first round it's gone on now 7 minutes. What's happened to the timekeeper? And he felt like he should look to see what has happened to the timekeeper, but he couldn't take his eyes off the action. So it was incredible, really, that fight with Tommy Hearns.
Well, and along those lines, I mean, you go back, and we're going to do this when we reminisce because it's only 3 rounds, but that first round is so epic, and there's 2 different calls, and you were on Al Bernstein's Unplugged podcast, another plug for something else that you've been on. Al does a fantastic job. Love him even now, 35, 40 years later on the commentary. Al's on the call that night with the other Al, the legendary Al Michaels, the broadcaster. And Al Michaels even exclaims in the middle of that first round, how long can they keep this up? Not very long. He answers his own question. Not very long at this pace. Barry Tompkins was on the HBO replay call, and he reminds himself and everybody, this is still the first round. That is all of us, Brian, about the first round of Hagler and Hearns, that you get like a minute deep and a minute and a half deep, and you realize this is still only the first round of the fight, is the whole point about that one coming up.
Yeah, and you mentioned great commentators there. I think Barry at the end of the round said you might have just watched the best even round ever in boxing. Yes. And Al Bernstein called it immediately. He said it was the best round in middleweight history. And those are, epic kind of moments, for guys like ourselves who we're just so enthralled of this unbelievable sport that we have had this long fascination with. Boxing, you can make the case that it's not really a sport for a civilized society, and you can make a strong argument in terms of that, but that doesn't diminish the fascination that we have for it and the courage that these guys demonstrate. That's why we're drawn to it. It's unbelievable courage, and I think that those 2 fights, Hagler Hearns and also Leonard-Hagler, in terms of what Leonard was confronting that night, he was taking on the man who had stepped up to that mountaintop and destroyed Tommy Hearns that night. And the courage, therefore, that these guys all exhibit when they climb into the ring, we shouldn't take that for granted. We're privileged to witness.
No doubt. And there's so many subplots. Get the book. The Super Fight is the name of the book. Plug away. It's available on Amazon. Obviously, there's a lot of audience listening in the United States. Amazon is the best way to get it. Can they get it online any other way? Plug away, Brian, on how they get your book if they want to read more about what they've been hearing.
Yeah, look, Amazon, bookshop.org. It's available on the website, briandooganmedia.com. I really appreciate, TJ, you giving me this opportunity, but more I appreciate the fact that you know your boxing and you know your sport, and listen, we could have a fantastic conversation. I know you're a big Bucks fan and everything. And my first Super Bowl, the Bucks prevailed. So I'm surprised you haven't brought that up during the course of the conversation.
We are doing this interview right now, and Brian knows this, that over my shoulder on the video, and people can't see us while we're doing the audio podcast, and there's only video clips, but you're seeing a Buccaneers Super Bowl hat over my shoulder right now, Brian. So you know I'm that through and through. He's a little more Americanized than what I realized even when this conversation began, because he knows the Super Bowl and he likes like Florida seafood and other things, Brian. And Brian has also written the autobiography of Joe Calzaghe, right, as well as other books, and covered the sport for many, many years. So we encourage you again to find his site, Brian Doogan, spell it B-R-I-A-N, Doogan, D-O-O-G-A-N, briandooganmedia.com to find out more. The book again is called The Super Fight, Leonard-Hagler. Find that anywhere online, Amazon, what did you say? Bookstop.org. Find the book, get the book. Fantastic stuff about how big a deal this fight was. I mean, again, one more time, Marvin Hagler got 10 million guaranteed. Brian, help me with my figures. Marvin got 10 million guaranteed, which in the present day economy is probably 30 million guaranteed with the inflation and the money. Leonard got like 6 or 7 million guaranteed. That didn't happen if you weren't heavyweights. We can't convey that enough. That's how big a deal this was. That's why you wrote the book about how big a deal this was.
TJ, this was billed as the first $100 million fight. It didn't quite reach that far, but you're right in your figures. It was enormous. It was actually something that didn't happen outside of the heavyweight division. They, tore down the rule book as far as that was concerned, the two of them, because they were just so good. And this was, if you like, a golden era. This was a glorious era for the middleweights. And this was the centerpiece fight. This was the showpiece event.
Amen. And again, as a Sugar Ray Leonard fan, I'm still happy to this day. He got his hand raised once and for all. And the amazing thing, we keep saying this, Marvin Hagler never fought again. Leonard fought on and fought, 4 or 5 more times, fought Duran a third time, fought Hearns a second time, more controversial judging. What a surprise, Brian. They had a draw in 1990, a few years after this fight with Marvin Hagler. Leonard fought on. Hagler never fought again. So many subplots out of this fight. I love it. If you can't tell, Brian and I have been going on, and we could go for like an hour more, but I got to get out of here. He's got to get out of here as well. Go get the book, The Super Fight. Brian Doogan, thank you for reaching out to us and knocking on the door on the Big Fight Weekend website and podcast. It was my pleasure to have you. Good luck with the book. And you did so well. We've got to have you back later on at some point down the line. But good luck with the book and the continued success of the Super Fight. Thank you for hanging with me here on the Big Fight Weekend podcast.
Thanks very much, TJ. I'd love to get back on with you, and we'll talk Bucks next.